All right, let's dive in. Today we're tackling a specific, really quite striking event from June 2025. We're talking about the deployment of National Guard troops right into Los Angeles.
Yeah, and we've got this one key source guiding us for this deep dive. It's an article that really digs into the reasons and maybe the implications of this particular moment.
Right, and our goal here is really to unpack what happened.
Exactly. We'll look at the sequence of events, the official explanation for why the troops were sent in, and then we'll explore what the source article suggests might be the real underlying dynamic at play.
And put it all into some context, right? Historical, legal context.
For sure. Because, as this article strongly suggests, the central tension here isn't just about whether there were clashes happening.
Mm-hmm. It forces us to ask, was this troop deployment truly about restoring order? Or was there maybe a much broader political message being sent? Let's get into the details.
So the timeline for this is pretty tight, yeah. The order to deploy, over 2,000 National Guard troops, it came down on June 7th. Right, which was right after 2 days where protests had flared up in the LA area.
And what kicked those off?
Well, it started with federal immigration agents conducting sweeps across LA County. This was over that weekend. They were specifically targeting unauthorized migrants. The article points out they arrested more than 40 people. And, it's probably relevant here that roughly a third of LA County residents are immigrants.
Right, a third. That's significant. So you have these federal raids, these arrests, and then you see crowds gathering in places like Paramount and Compton, sort of south of the city.
Mm-hmm. And also right downtown, outside a federal building there that actually includes a detention center.
And things got confrontational.
Yeah, the situation became, confrontational. Officers used tear gas, flashbang grenades, to disperse the crowds. And the source mentions some protesters responded by throwing rocks at federal agents.
Okay. And this is where the administration offered its official reason for sending in the Guard. The stated goal, they said, was to restore peace and quell these protests.
Yeah, and the LA mayor, Karen Bass, she also put out a statement. She acknowledged the right to peaceful protest, but drew a line basically saying violence and destruction are unacceptable.
Okay, so that's the official narrative. Restore order.
Right. But this article we're looking at, it takes a sharply different view. It argues that this deployment wasn't simply about stopping rioting. It was, and this is a quote, a thinly veiled message aimed directly at Democratic-run cities.
A message.
Yeah.
A message that was saying what exactly?
Well, the article interprets it as a form of political retribution. A warning, maybe. A warning to cities that were seen as resisting the administration's immigration policies, what the source actually calls its mass deportation machine.
Wow.
It suggests the message was pretty clear. Consequences await if you don't, align with us on this.
And the article really leans on some key details to make this argument, doesn't it? Like it highlights that as of Saturday night, the clashes were actually described as relatively contained.
Relatively contained, exactly. And here's a crucial point the article makes. Local officials had given, quote, no indication that they needed help from the federal government.
No indication they needed help. That seems important.
It's a critical piece of the puzzle the article presents, yeah. And California's Governor Gavin Newsom is quoted on X saying there was currently no unmet need for federal assistance. And he called the deployment purposefully inflammatory and said it would likely only escalate tensions.
So the governor himself is pushing back hard.
Pretty strongly, yeah. That perspective from the state's leader really challenges the idea that this was some necessary intervention requested by, the people on the ground.
Right. It really sets up a clear conflict in how the situation was being seen. Now, how did the administration portray things, the events, the protesters, from their side?
Well, the source shows the administration used much, much stronger language. Stephen Miller, a deputy chief of staff, he characterized the protests as a violent insurrection.
A violent insurrection. That's pretty loaded language for protests described elsewhere as relatively contained.
It is. Very strong language. And there were other strong statements flying around, too. Pete Hegseth, the defense secretary, apparently even went so far as to threaten to send in Marines from nearby Camp Pendleton.
Marines.
Yeah.
Seriously. That feels like a huge step beyond the National Guard.
Definitely a big escalation, yeah. Meanwhile, the administration, they consistently justified the immigration raids by insisting they were targeting criminals. And they framed the protesters as radical leftists who were trying to obstruct the deportation of, quote, dangerous people.
Okay, so they're framing the raids as targeting criminals and the protesters as interfering. Did the article include any data on the people arrested? to back up that criminal claim.
It did mention some data from ICEA, yeah. It said that since October 1st, roughly half of the migrants arrested had been charged with or convicted of a criminal offense. And the article also quotes U.S. Attorney Bill Saley saying, "We're arresting really bad people out there. That's what the American people voted for."
Which, as you can see, aligns perfectly with the administration's framing, right? That this was necessary law enforcement and the protests were basically getting in the way.
Exactly. It paints a very specific picture.
Okay, let's shift a bit to the legal side, the historical context. The article points out something really significant here. Deploying the National Guard without the state governor's consent is, quote, extremely rare.
Yeah, that rarity is a key insight the article really wants us to grasp. It's not supposed to happen this way, usually. The source mentions the administration had been kind of flirting with invoking the Insurrection Act of 1807.
The Insurrection Act, what exactly is that? Can you break that down a bit?
Sure. Think of it as like a break glass in case of emergency law. It's old, 1807. It gives the president the power to use the regular military, the army, or to federalize the National Guard, like take control of them, to put down domestic uprisings or enforce federal law.
Okay, a big deal power. But they didn't fully invoke it here, you said.
No, according to the article, they didn't go that far. They sort of danced around it.
So what legal argument did they use then to justify sending in the Guard without the governor saying yes?
Well, according to the article, Mr. Trump argued the protests were, and this is the phrasing, a form of rebellion against the authority of the government. He claimed this allowed him to deploy National Guard troops for specific federal purposes.
Federal purposes, okay. And the actual order, the memorandum, did it specify how the troops were allowed to be used? Was it limited?
Yes, it was apparently very specific on that point. It stated the troops would only be used to temporarily protect federal agents and property. Just that.
Only protecting federal agents and property.
Right, and the article highlights that anything beyond that specific mandate would likely run afoul of another law, the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878.
Posse Comitatus.
Yeah.
Which is the law that generally prevents the military from being used in domestic law enforcement, right?
Exactly. So legally, their role was meant to be pretty narrow, secure federal assets, not engage in broader crowd control or policing unless those federal assets were directly threatened.
So there's maybe a gap between the violent insurrection rhetoric and the actual legal limits placed on the troops, at least on paper.
That legal distinction is definitely important when you consider the administration's public statements versus the, actual operational limits imposed.
The article gives us a couple of historical markers, too, that really show just how unusual this 2025 deployment approach was.
It does. It points out that the most recent comparable instance where a president federalized the Guard without a governor's consent, where you have to go way back, 1965.
1965, what was that?
That was when President Lyndon Johnson, LBJ, federalized the Alabama National Guard. But it was to protect civil rights marchers from hostile state and local forces during the Selma marches.
Wow, okay, so a dramatically different scenario in historical context there. Protecting rights, not quelling protests against federal action.
Completely different context, yeah.
And there's a more recent example involving LA riots, but with a key difference.
Right. The article brings up the 1992 LA riots, a huge event. But in that case, California's Governor Pete Wilson did request federal help from President George H.W. Bush. And the Insurrection Act was invoked then. So federal troops were sent, Army and Marines, I think, but it was crucially at the state's request.
So not unilaterally imposed by the federal government like the article suggests happened in 2025.
Yeah.
That's the crucial distinction.
That's the key difference highlighted, yeah. Requested versus imposed.
And there's an interesting little detail from a report about that 1992 deployment, something from 97.
Yeah, kind of a footnote, but relevant. That report found that the active duty troops sent in 92 actually coordinated poorly with the local police, the LAPD, and also that they weren't really adequately equipped or trained for urban crowd control.
So it points to the practical challenges, maybe the potential ineffectiveness, of sending federal military forces into complex city situations, even when they are requested.
It definitely raises those questions about logistics and suitability, yeah.
Okay, so bringing this back to the 2025 deployment we're focused on, the article certainly highlights the potential for this kind of situation to, well, escalate.
Absolutely. You've got this built-in tension, right, between federal authority flexing its muscle and local leadership pushing back. And the article notes the possibility of, negative reactions from residents seeing what they might perceive as unwanted federal troops in their own neighborhoods could easily raise tensions.
And that earlier threat you mentioned about sending Marines, the article calls that rash.
It does. The article views that kind of language, that threat, as more likely to inflame the situation than to, calm it down. It seems pretty clear.
And could this sort of thing, this kind of tension or deployment, happen in other places? Is LA unique here?
Well, the source suggests that's a real possibility. Los Angeles isn't the only city where federal immigration raids are happening, right? And the administration had been very public in its criticism of other liberal cities, particularly those with so-called sanctuary policies. It mentions places like Chicago, Boston, Denver.
So the underlying issues aren't just in LA.
No, the conditions that led to this tension in LA, they aren't unique. So you could potentially see similar standoffs elsewhere.
Okay, so putting it all together from this article, we've really explored two very different ways to interpret this troop deployment in LA back in June 2025.
Yeah. On one hand, you have the administration's official justification. Deploying troops was necessary to quell what they called a violent insurrection, following legitimate law enforcement actions targeting, in their words, dangerous criminals. That's one narrative.
Right. But on the other hand, this article presents a pretty compelling argument, suggesting that given the relatively contained nature of the protests and the very clear lack of a request from local or state officials, the deployment was actually something else. A highly unusual, politically charged maneuver, maybe a message of retribution sent to a city perceived as resistant to federal immigration policies.
We've looked at the sequence of events, the raids, the protests, the deployment. We've seen the contrasting perspectives from federal and local leaders, which were miles apart. And we've touched on the rare legal and historical context surrounding a deployment like this, one without a governor's consent.
And understanding these different layers, the factual events that happen, the competing explanations offered, the potential political motivations suggested by the source, the historical backdrop, the legal constraints, it's really essential, isn't it? For making sense of complex news stories like this one, it helps you, the listener, look beyond just the surface headlines and consider the deeper dynamics that might be at play.
Definitely. This event, as presented in the source material, it really does highlight the complicated and, let's face it, often fraught relationship between federal power and local autonomy, especially when you add in politically sensitive issues like immigration enforcement and, of course, the fundamental right to protest.
It really makes you pause and think about the implications, doesn't it? How does this specific instance, as the article describes it, how does it illustrate the potential friction between different levels of government, especially during times of high political tension? And what questions does it raise for you about that balance of power? Or maybe about the use of federal force in domestic situations, particularly when it happens without state consent? Something to definitely consider as you process all this information.